The snow fell in lazy spirals outside my kitchen window, covering the world in a blanket of quiet. Winter had arrived in full force, its icy breath creeping under the doorframe despite my best efforts to seal the house. The heater hummed in the background, a weak effort to combat the chill. Yet, my mind was far from the temperature outside. I stirred the pot on the stove absent-mindedly, the rich aroma of stew wafting through the air, filling the empty house with an illusion of warmth and life. It was New Year's Eve, a time for celebration, joy, and laughter. But this year, it was just me and my son, Martin. My husband, no Daniel, was spending it with his young mistress, under the guise of business commitments. He hadn't even tried to hide it this time. The crumpled text message on his phone had told me everything I needed to know. Looking forward to our weekend together. I let out a heavy sigh, leaning against the counter. I'd always known. For years now, I had learned to stomach the faint whiff of perfume that wasn't mine, the late nights at work, the growing distance in his eyes. I had told myself I didn't care, that the spark had long since died, replaced by the mundane obligations of life. But tonight, the loneliness was sharper, the betrayal harder to ignore. Martin would be home soon. I glanced at the clock. 7:45 p.m. He'd gone to visit an old friend but promised to return to Ring in the new year with me. At 22, he was already taller than his father, his shoulders broader, his presence a stark contrast to the absence his father left behind. When the door creaked open, I turned, trying to paste on a smile. "Mom," Martin called, his deep voice resonating in the small house. He stomped the snow from his boots and unwound his scarf, his cheeks red from the cold. "You're back just in time," I said, keeping my voice light. "The stew's almost ready." He walked into the kitchen, the warmth quickly reddening his face further. "Smells great in here. You didn't have to make a big dinner for just us." "It's tradition," I said with a shrug, ladling soup into 2 bowls. "Besides, I needed to keep busy." He hesitated for a moment before taking the bowls to the table. "Dad didn't even call, did he?" His words were soft but carried an edge that made my chest tighten. I busied myself with the utensils, avoiding his gaze. "He's busy. With her, right?" His words hung in the air, heavier than the snow outside. When I didn't respond, he pressed on. "Why do you let him get away with it, Mom? You deserve better." I set the spoons down carefully, my hands trembling slightly. "It's not that simple, Martin." He looked at me, his brown eyes, the same as mine, filled with a frustration that made him seem far older than his years. "Yes, it is." We ate in silence after that, the only sound the clink of silverware against porcelain. I couldn't bring myself to say what needed to be said. How could I explain the complicated knot of love, duty, and fear that bound me to his father? As the hours ticked closer to midnight, Martin pulled out a bottle of champagne he'd hidden behind his coat. "For us," he said with a smile, pouring 2 glasses. "To new beginnings." I raised my glass reluctantly. "To new beginnings." We drank, the bubbles tickling my nose, the warmth spreading through my chest. I watched Martin as he leaned back in his chair, the dim light softening the sharp lines of his face. He was beautiful, a man now, but still my boy. And yet, there was a tension in the way he looked at me, an intensity that made me shift in my seat. "You should stop sacrificing for him," Martin said suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. "You've spent your whole life putting everyone else first. Don't you think it's time to do something for yourself?" The question caught me off guard. I laughed nervously, waving it off. "Oh, Martin, it's not that simple." "It is." His gaze didn't waver, and for a moment, I saw something in his expression that was unfamiliar. It was concern, yes, but also something deeper, something unspoken. "Let's not talk about your father," I said, standing up quickly to clear the dishes. "It's New Year's Eve. We should be celebrating." But as I turned, Martin grabbed my wrist gently, stopping me in my tracks. The warmth of his touch seeped through the thin fabric of my sleeve, grounding me. "Mom," he said softly, his voice a plea. "You don't have to pretend with me." The words unraveled something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I felt the sting of tears. I had spent so long being strong, being the glue that held our fractured family together, that I had forgotten what it felt like to let go. "I'm fine," I whispered, but even I didn't believe it. Martin stood, his height dwarfing mine, and pulled me into an embrace. His arms were strong, steady, and for the first time in years, I felt safe. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. "You deserve to be happy, Mom," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "Please, promise me you'll try." I nodded, unable to speak. The clock struck midnight, and outside, fireworks lit up the sky. But inside, in the quiet warmth of our home, something else ignited, a fragile hope, a promise of change. As we pulled apart, his hands lingered on my shoulders, his gaze searching mine. The intensity was still there, a question unspoken, but for now, it remained suspended between us. "Happy New Year, Mom," he said softly. "Happy New Year, Martin." The world outside was silent when I woke the next morning. Snow muffled every sound, wrapping the neighborhood in a cocoon of stillness. The faint light of dawn crept through the curtains, painting the room in soft blues and grays. I lay there for a moment, trying to remember the last time I had woken up feeling this. Uncertain. Martin had stayed the night, of course. It was his home as much as mine, but something about the way he had held me, the quiet intensity in his voice as he urged me to think about my happiness, lingered like an imprint on my skin. I pulled the covers tighter around myself, wishing for the clarity I knew I wouldn't find. My mind kept replaying the moment from the night before, Martin's arms around me, his words a gentle but firm insistence that I deserved better. He was right, of course. But what did better even look like after all these years? The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled me from my thoughts. Martin knocked lightly before pushing the door open, balancing a tray in his hands. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "I thought you might like breakfast." I sat up, startled. "You didn't have to do that, Martin." "I wanted to," he replied simply, setting the tray down on the bed. The tray was a modest affair, scrambled eggs, toast, and a steaming cup of coffee, but the effort behind it was clear. "You've been taking care of everyone for so long, Mom. Let someone take care of you for a change," he said, sitting down on the edge of the bed. His words brought a lump to my throat. I looked at him, his face earnest, and for a moment, I didn't see my son but a man. A kind, thoughtful man who had grown into himself in ways I hadn't fully noticed until now. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He smiled, that familiar boyish grin that always melted my heart. "It's nothing. You deserve it." We sat in comfortable silence while I ate, the tension from the previous night seemingly gone, though an undercurrent of something unspoken lingered. Martin's gaze drifted to the window, watching the snow fall in lazy patterns. "You ever think about just leaving?" he asked suddenly, his tone casual but his eyes sharp as they flicked back to me. I paused mid-bite, the question catching me off guard. "Leaving? You mean leaving your father?" He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah. Starting over. You've been tied to him for so long, and he doesn't." He stopped, exhaling heavily. "He doesn't deserve you, Mom." I set my fork down, my appetite gone. "It's not that simple, Martin." "Why not?" he pressed, his frustration breaking through. "You're not happy. You're just surviving. I don't want that for you." His words cut deeper than I expected, and I looked away, unsure how to respond. He wasn't wrong. I had spent years clinging to a marriage that had eroded under the weight of lies and indifference. But leaving, starting over at 52? It felt impossible. Martin, I began, my voice trembling. I appreciate what you're saying. I really do. But I've made my choices, and... Mom, he interrupted, leaning closer, his voice low and urgent. You don't have to settle. Not for him. Not for anyone. The intensity in his eyes held me captive, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. His hand reached out, covering mine where it rested on the tray. His touch was warm, grounding, and I felt a strange mix of comfort and unease. I just want you to be happy, he said softly. That's all I've ever wanted. My throat tightened, and I looked down at our hands, his fingers strong and steady against mine. There was something in his touch, in the way he looked at me, that made my heart race in a way I couldn't quite name. I don't know how to be happy anymore, I admitted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Martin's grip on my hand tightened, and he leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Then let me help you find it. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. I looked up at him, his face so close that I could see every detail, the slight stubble on his jaw, the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. There was a tenderness there, a quiet intensity that made my breath hitch. Martin, I began, my voice faltering. He didn't move, didn't break eye contact. You've given everything to everyone else, Mom. It's time someone gave something back to you. His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and insistent. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to navigate the storm of emotions swirling inside me. Before I could respond, Martin pulled back, his expression softening. Sorry, he said quickly, running a hand through his hair. I didn't mean to push. It's okay, I managed, my voice barely audible. He stood, taking the empty tray with him. I'll be in the living room if you need me. As he left, the door clicking softly shut behind him, I let out a shaky breath. The silence of the room was deafening, and I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. Martin's words echoed in my mind, their weight impossible to ignore. For the first time in years, I found myself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he was right. The months that followed that New Year's Eve were a blur of change and emotion. It started with conversations, tentative at first, then more decisive as the weight of Martin's words settled over me. He was right. I couldn't keep living a life that made me feel invisible. The decision to leave Daniel wasn't easy, but it was inevitable. He didn't protest much when I told him I wanted a divorce. Perhaps he was relieved. The cracks in our marriage had been widening for years, and by now, they were too deep to mend. He offered a feeble apology, which felt hollow, and the finality of his words stung more than I had expected. But when I walked out of his office, the divorce papers signed, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Martin was there for every step of it, his steady presence a lifeline in a storm of uncertainty. He helped me move into a modest home not far from where we used to live, a cozy little place with just enough room for the two of us. I insisted he didn't have to stay, that he could keep his independence, but he refused. I'm not leaving you alone, Mom, he said, his tone brooking no argument. And so, we began this new chapter together. The first few weeks were an adjustment. The house felt too quiet without Daniel's presence, but it wasn't an unpleasant silence. For the first time in years, I could breathe. Martin made the transition easier than I'd expected. He threw himself into fixing up the house, repairing squeaky doors and repainting the walls. He turned the spare bedroom into his workspace, but it quickly became a shared sanctuary where we spent evenings talking or quietly reading. Our relationship had always been close, but now, without the strain of my failing marriage overshadowing everything, it grew deeper. We spent more time together, cooking dinner, going for walks in the snowy park, or simply sitting by the fireplace, talking about things we'd never had the chance to say before. You're smiling more, Martin remarked one evening as we shared a cup of tea on the couch. I laughed softly, cradling the warm mug in my hands. Am I? Yeah, he said, leaning back and studying me with a faint smile. It's nice to see. His words warmed me more than the tea ever could. One night, as winter began to thaw into spring, we found ourselves in the kitchen after dinner. Martin was washing the dishes, and I was drying them, the simple routine oddly comforting. Do you ever regret it? He asked suddenly, his voice quiet. I paused, the plate in my hands forgotten for a moment. Regret what? Leaving Dad. Starting over. I placed the plate on the counter and turned to him. His face was serious, his brow furrowed in a way that reminded me of when he was a little boy trying to figure out a difficult puzzle. Not for a second, I said honestly. It wasn't easy, but staying would have been harder. I needed to do this, for me. He nodded, his expression softening. I'm glad you did. You deserve to be happy, Mom. I reached out and touched his arm, the gesture instinctive. I am happy, Martin. Thanks to you. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged, heavy with something unspoken. I pulled my hand back quickly, turning to grab another dish, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. As the weeks turned into months, that feeling only grew stronger. Martin and I settled into an easy rhythm, but there were moments when the closeness felt almost too intimate, like when he brushed my hair from my face as we laughed over a shared joke, or when his hand lingered on mine a second longer than necessary as he passed me a cup of coffee. It wasn't just the little things, though. It was the way he looked at me, the way his presence seemed to fill the room, making it impossible to ignore the way my heart raced when he smiled at me. I told myself it was just the closeness of our situation, the comfort of having someone who truly cared. But late at night, when the house was still, I couldn't deny the strange ache that had taken root in my chest. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching an old movie, Martin leaned closer, his shoulder brushing against mine. It was a casual gesture, but my heart jumped all the same. Are you cold? He asked, his voice low. I shook my head, unable to meet his gaze. No, I'm fine. Here, he said, draping a blanket over both of us. His arm stayed around my shoulders, and I could feel the steady warmth of his body against mine. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, resting my head on his chest. His hand settled on my arm, a gentle, reassuring weight. Is this okay? He asked softly, his breath warm against my hair. Yes, I whispered, my voice barely audible. We stayed like that for a long time, the movie forgotten as the silence wrapped around us. It was comforting, yes, but it was also something more, a connection I couldn't name but couldn't deny. As the seasons changed, so did our relationship. The lines that once defined us as mother and son began to blur, replaced by something deeper, more complex. Martin became my confidant, my anchor, my partner in this new life we had built together. I wasn't sure where this path would lead us, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid. I felt seen. I felt loved. And as I looked at Martin, his gaze steady and unyielding, I knew I wasn't alone. We were walking this path together, and whatever came next, I was ready to face it with him by my side. As spring gave way to summer, the house transformed. Windows stayed open, letting in the scent of blooming flowers and the sound of distant birdsong. Light seemed to fill every corner, banishing the shadows that had once weighed heavy on my heart. With Martin by my side, life felt lighter, freer, as if I had finally stepped into a version of myself I hadn't known was possible. But with that lightness came a deeper awareness of how much my life had changed, and how much Martin had become my constant. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was my partner in every sense of the word. We'd fallen into an unspoken rhythm of care and affection, one that neither of us questioned but both of us cherished. One warm evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, Martin and I sat on the back porch, sipping iced tea. The garden we'd planted together was thriving, the beds bursting with vibrant flowers and neat rows of vegetables. I think this place suits you, Martin said, breaking the comfortable silence. You seem settled. I feel settled, I admitted, glancing at him. For the first time in a long while. He smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. Good. You deserve that. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep inside me. I looked away, suddenly shy, but I felt his gaze linger. What about you? I asked, turning the focus back on him. Are you happy here? Or do you feel like you've given up too much to stay with me? Given up, he echoed, a faint laugh escaping him. Mom, I haven't given up anything. Being here with you has been, he paused, searching for the right words. It's been the best decision I've ever made. His words settled over me like a warm embrace, and I couldn't stop the smile that tugged at my lips. I don't know what I'd do without you, I said quietly. You don't have to know, he replied, his voice just as soft. Because I'm not going anywhere. As the weeks passed, Martin's presence felt less like a constant reminder of the past and more like a glimpse of the future. We spent mornings in the garden, afternoons fixing up the house, and evenings sharing stories or sitting in companionable silence. It was a simple life, but it was ours, and it was enough. One night, as we cleared the dinner table, Martin turned to me with a thoughtful expression. There's a concert in the park this weekend, he said. I thought it might be nice to go. A concert? I asked, surprised. You don't think that's more your scene than mine? He grinned. You like music just as much as I do. Come on, it'll be fun. And so that Saturday, we packed a picnic basket and made our way to the park. The air was warm and alive with the sounds of laughter and music. We found a spot under a large oak tree, spreading out a blanket as the band tuned their instruments. As the music began, I watched Martin, his face lit with a boyish excitement I hadn't seen in years. He caught me staring and laughed. What? He asked. Nothing, I said, smiling. You just look happy. I am, he said simply, and his gaze lingered on mine a moment longer than usual. When the music slowed, and couples began to dance in the fading light, Martin stood and held out his hand. Dance with me. Martin, I protested, laughing. I don't dance. You don't have to be good, he said, his grin widening. Just follow my lead. Reluctantly, I let him pull me to my feet. His hand was warm in mine, his touch steady as he guided me through the simple steps. At first, I felt self-conscious, but as the music swelled and the world around us seemed to fade, I found myself relaxing into the moment. You're doing great, he teased, his eyes twinkling. Liar, I said, laughing. But I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt light, free, alive. That night, as we walked home under a canopy of stars, Martin reached for my hand. I let him take it, the gesture so natural, so right, that it didn't even occur to me to pull away. Thank you for tonight, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to thank me, he replied. I just want to see you smile. When we reached the house, I hesitated on the porch, turning to face him. The air between us felt charged, filled with something unspoken. For a moment, neither of us moved. Martin, I began, but he cut me off, his voice gentle. You don't have to say anything, he said, stepping closer. I just want you to know that whatever this is, whatever we have, it's enough for me. You're enough for me. My breath hitched, and I felt the sting of tears. I reached out, cupping his face in my hands, and for the first time, I let myself feel the depth of what had grown between us. I don't know what the future holds, I said, my voice trembling. But I do know that I don't want to face it without you. His smile was soft, his eyes shining with an emotion that mirrored my own. Then you won't have to. He leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to my forehead, and I closed my eyes, letting the moment wash over me. It wasn't the start of something new. It was the continuation of something that had been building for months, something neither of us could deny any longer. The seasons turned, and life settled into a new rhythm. Our bond grew stronger, deeper, until it felt as natural as breathing. The world outside may not have understood, but it didn't matter. We had found something rare and precious, something that filled the empty spaces in our hearts and gave us hope for the future. And as I sat on the porch one summer evening, watching Martin tend to the garden, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. He looked up and caught my eye, his smile lighting up the fading day. "I love you, Mom," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I love you too, Martin," I replied, my heart full. Whatever lay ahead, we would face it together. And that was all I needed.